Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Brothers War spoilers. So this spoiler season, a little weird, because I was out in Vegas for Magic 30, so I couldn't do videos every day, so we're in catch-up mode, and we're kind of doing set review style spoilers, going color by color through the set, talking about every single relevant card. So we started with white, we moved on to blue, which means today is Black Day, and black in this set is pretty sweet. Got some of the sweetest commander cards from the entire set, some interesting standard stuff, some really juicy new additions to the multiverse. So before we jump into it and talk about all the black cards from Brothers War, a couple of quick reminders. Number one, if you want to see the full set or any future spoilers, you should head on over to MTGPreviews.com. Number two, if you need some Brothers War cards, you can snag them from our awesome sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. And if you get a free goldfish sticker, just let them know you want one in your order notes and they will hook you up. Anyway, let's talk about the black cards from the Brothers War. First up in the world of black cards, we get a new one drop in, I think it's a pretty good one, in Ashnod Flesh Mechanist. So this is a 1-mana 1/1 legendary human artificer. It is Death Touch. When it attacks, you can sack another creature to make a tap Power Stone. Not super exciting. And then you can pay 5, exile a creature from your graveyard to make a tap 3/3 colorless zombie artifact creature token. So on level 1, Ashnod is one of those one drops that's fine early. A 1-mana 1/1 might not sound like much, but Death Touch really helps here. And then it's also fine later in the game. The problem with some aggro 1-drops is they lose their value as the game goes along, thanks to that last ability on Ashnod, where you can exile a creature to make a 3/3. This is a 1-drop that's not the end of the world coming off the top of your deck on turn 5 or turn 6. So that's already pretty sweet. That's what I want to see out of my competitive 1-drops. More importantly, while a 1-mana 1/1 might not sound exciting, with Death Touch, we've seen cards like this be pretty playable in the past. Not always in the main deck, but at least in the sideboard. Think of things like Typhoid Rats or Fang of Shigeki more recently. These cards almost work like removal spells, where if your opponent's playing Shieldreds or Graveyard Trespassers or Tolarian Terrors or Adolines, these big threats, your 1-drop trades up with them, so it makes it kind of like a strange removal spell. And yes, if your opponent spends a removal spell on your Ashnod, I guess you're a little sad because it's not going to trade with Shieldred, but you're probably winning that exchange as well, because that's one less removal spell that can kill your bigger threats. So I think being a 1-mana 1/1 Death Touch actually means Ashnod has a decent chance to see play, if not in the main deck, at least in the sideboard, because it trades up with some of the best creatures in Standard, and that last ability gives it a little value in the late game as well. The sack a creature to make a Power Stone, I think for most decks that's not very exciting, although if you're trying to ramp into big artifacts or big artifact abilities, or maybe if you're playing the Oni Call Anvil deck, it could actually be good. Imagine in the Oni Call Anvil deck, you like sack an artifact creature to trigger your Oni Call Anvil to make a construct, which you can then sacrifice to your Ashnod the next turn to keep the process going, and you're getting Power Stones that you can sacrifice to Oni Call Anvil or other effects. So in that deck in specific, I think that ability could be pretty good. But in general, I'm excited about 1-mana 1/1 Death Touch with upside for the late game. And even though that last ability is pretty expensive, at least it's something. Like, we've seen Graveyard Marshal, Kessig Wolf Rider, sort of. These cheap creatures that can make tokens from the graveyard, they do offer a lot of value. We haven't really seen Wolf Rider actually take off, but it's pretty bad as an aggro creature. A 1-power menace are not that exciting, but like Graveyard Marshal saw some play. So it's nice to have this mana sink, where in the late game, your 1-drop has the ability to do something. So I don't think Ashnod beats out a Valve Sleeper. That's probably still black 1-drop number 1 for Standard, but beyond a Valve Sleeper, this is probably black 1-drop number 2, which, being legendary, maybe limits the number that you can play, although again, you want to aggressively trade this off with bigger creatures, so you're not really necessarily planning on having this stick around for a long time, so that does help there. But I can imagine a copy or two maybe showing up in the main deck. Worst case, seems like a sideboard all-star for trading up with those big threats in Standard. We also got, speaking of Ashnod, Ashnod's Harvester, a 2-mana 3/1 construct that when it attacks, you can exile a card from a graveyard, and then you can unearth it for 2. So this is the card that I think is close enough to having playable stats and abilities to be worth mentioning. I don't think it's going to beat out Tenacious Underdog and some of the other really good 2-drops that we already have in Standard, but it's close enough that I wanted to give it a little bit shout out. 3 power on your 2-drops, not bad. Its ability, getting rid of the graveyard, is helpful. Like, we do have a lot of things that care about the graveyard. This exiles the Tenacious Underdog from the graveyard, which is pretty valuable. So keep it in mind, if there's a deck that is is aggro and black, but also heavily cares about artifact synergies. This goes up in value, but in the generic black decks, good, but probably not quite good enough. We also got Clay Revenant, a 1-mana 1/2 golem. Enters the battlefield tapped, and you pay 2 and a black to return it from your graveyard to your hand. Wanted to mention this one just because it's very much like Sanitarium Skeleton. Worse because it enters the battlefield tapped, so worse on defense, but there could be some synergy to take advantage of this. Imagine like the Oni Call Anvil deck. You could play this maybe as a one-of, and it just gives you a repeatable way to start your engine. It's not efficient, it's not good, but if you're just like, oh no, I really need an artifact to sacrifice to get my anvil going again, this is going to get the job done for what, 4 total mana, 3 to get it back to your hand, 1 to play it, and then you sack it to the anvil. So I could see uses for it. So again, I don't think this is a staple level card, but in the right deck that really cares about artifacts being sacked, it could have some value. We also got the return of Corrupt, and I'm actually kind of excited about Corrupt. I love Corrupt. I used to be a mono black player in Pauper, and Corrupt was one of the main finishers. So 6 mana sorcery, deals damage to any target equal to the number of swamps you control. You gain life equal to the damage dealt this way. So is Corrupt going to be good in 2022? Probably not. Last time it was in Standard, in Mono Black Devotion Standard, and it saw the fringiest of play. It was definitely not a staple in those decks. Every once in a while, someone would play it. Like I said, it's kind of a Pauper staple, or at least was in the past. Maybe in a world of mythics and rares that just can't keep up with those cards, but there is some interesting options here. Like, Mono Black is already a very popular archetype, so decks that are full of swamps, those already exist and are really good in Standard. And imagine a world where you have, like, Shieldred into Invoke Despair into Corrupt. You could almost be like a Mono Black burn deck, as weird as that sounds, playing some of the best cards in Standard. Like, there's a decent chance with a curve like this that you can more or less just burn your opponent out of the game without ever dealing any combat damage, and if you deal some combat damage, it's going to get even easier. So I think Corrupt is a card I'm excited to try in the mono black decks. Is it going to be in the top tier black decks? It's probably too slow. It probably gets negated or make disappeared or duressed or whatever, so maybe it's not good enough, but I'm hyped to try mono black burn and see if we can make Corrupt work. We also got, speaking of exciting reprints, Diabolic Intent. So Diabolic Intent, it's literally Demonic Tutor, except you get a sack of creatures and additional cost to cast it. This card is good from a value perspective. It was like a $30 card or something before this reprinting, so going to be a chase card to open, a good one to get more copies out in the wild, but I actually think it might be pretty good in multiple formats. So in Standard, I think that this can see play. We have plenty of synergies to make this sacrifice cost work. You can sack your Tenacious Underdog that you are going to lose anyway thanks to Blitz, the Oni Called Anvil decks, Wedding Announcement tokens, Cult Conscript, Distraction Specialist to get stuff back from the graveyard. So there's plenty of sack fodder going on to make this work. The question is going to be, what are you finding with this? What is that key piece that you really need to find, that you're willing to pay a 2 mana tax to find, and sacrifice a creature in this case? So the fuel is there. I'm excited to see what happens with this in Standard. Maybe we see some sort of toolboxy deck. We were just talking about like Corrupt. Maybe you can play a single Corrupt and find it with Diabolic Intent. I can imagine this snagging your Cruelty of Grix, let's say. Like in some Reanimator decks, that's the key card. Could grab your Shieldred, the Oni Called Anvil. So you do need to have something that's worth tutoring up to make this a card that you want in your deck, because again, a tutor, you're paying a tax to get the right card for the right situation. So if you don't have the right card for the right situation, that tax is not going to be very helpful. Like, you don't want to be paying that if you don't have something worth finding, but in the right shell, I think it can work. And as I mentioned, I think this could be the card that maybe makes Corrupt work. Corrupt is one of those cards that, again, I'm hyped for, but you don't really want to play 4 of them. It's 6 mana, it's a little clunky, but imagine the mono black decks where you play 1 Corrupt and you hope that you don't draw it, but then when you're in the situation where you're like, well, my opponent's tapped out, I got like 8 swamps on the battlefield, Corrupt just wins me the game, then you just sack your whatever, random Tenacious Underdog or your Ashnod or whatever, snag the Corrupt, win that way. So maybe we see a toolbox deck develop with Diabolic Intent driving it. So in Standard, it'll be interesting. There's plenty of fuel for it, but are there the right targets to find with your Diabolic Intent? Where this card gets really scary is in older formats. I think Pioneer is a format where this scares me the most. So Pioneer, we got multiple multiple top tier decks where this can slot right in. You got like the Sacrifice decks, Cauldron Familiar, Witches Oven, Mayhem Devils. This can be snagging your Mayhem Devil, or can be snagging some one of Silver Bullet out of your sideboard for the right matchup, your Graveyard Hate against Greasefang or whatever. Could also show up in Greasefang. You got like Stitcher Supplier to sack, Satyr Wayfinder to sack, and you have very specific cards that you want. Like Greasefang needs Greasefang to win. Like that's really the whole game plan of the deck. So being able to like Stitcher Supplier, mill your stuff, turn 2 Diabolic Intent away, grab the Greasefang, turn 3 Greasefang, get back the Parhelion, win. That seems like something that could work as well. And then once you get back to Modern, I think you got homes for it there as well. The most obvious one, Yawgmoth. Yawgmoth loves sacking its creatures, and you really need the Yawgmoth. Yawgmoth is like, you play this and you probably win. If you don't draw Yawgmoth, then you're left trying to Strangleroot Geist your way to victory, which isn't super practical. Could also show up in some combo decks, especially creature-y combo decks, like Thopter Sword combo. You usually got a bunch of bodies. You can sacrifice it, get the Thopter, get the sword, whatever you're missing. Maybe it could show up in Indomitable Creativity. You already have like Dwarven Minds, Hard Evidence to make the token to sacrifice, and then this can be additional copies essentially of creativity to find your creativity to win the game. Although I will say in Modern, there's a bit more competition. You got Profane Tutor, you got Wishclaw Talisman, you got Eladrami's Call, and it is worth pointing out that this isn't going to go in every deck. There are some decks that really want Profane Tutor, really want Wishclaw Talisman to get your like Ad Nauseam or some other non-creature spell to win the game. Diabolic Intent probably not going to fit there because you do need creatures to sacrifice. When these other tutors like Wishclaw, Profane Tutor, they don't have that requirement. On the other hand, Profane Tutor gets wrecked by Teferi. Wishclaw Talisman, when it goes wrong, your opponent is going to be able to tutor. Eladrami's Call only gets creatures, so there's certainly upside here. So I am really hyped about Diabolic Intent. I plan on playing this card a bunch, seeing how good it is. I think this has a chance to see play in Standard, definitely in Pioneer, maybe in Modern as well. In worst case, it's going to drop the price quite a bit for Commander players. Next up, more reprints in Disfigure. Just 1 mana instant, target creature gets -2/-2. There have been times in the past, like a decade ago when this came out in original Zendikar, the Disfigure was a very heavily played card. It even saw a little bit of play in Modern at one point, but we've had 10 more years of cards and removal spells, so it's not as exciting now as it was back then. If you look at Standard, just look at the top 25 most played creatures in the format, it gets a decent chunk of them. Most of the big 2-drops, Delver of Secrets, Urtai for some reason. So it does hit a decent amount of cards. On the other hand, it's probably just bad cut down. I think cut down probably kills more or less everything Disfigure does. If you go back to this page, cut down gets all of those cards, and it probably snags a few other cards as well. So I think Disfigure might not quite be good enough, even though it was in the past, just because cut down does kind of the same thing, but probably a little bit more. We also got Dream of Steel and Oil, a new option for our discard package. Also pretty interesting art there. So 1 mana sorcery, target opponent reveals their hand. You can grab an artifact or creature from it, and then choose an artifact or creature from their graveyard and exile those cards. So essentially like a weird limited Thoughtseize, but also some graveyard hate. Relevant perhaps because of Tenacious Underdog, saying that from the graveyard's good, unearthed creatures. So if you think about this card, our big discard options right now in Standard, we got Duress, the classic. We got Pilfer, which gets anything but for 2 mana. Where does Dreams of Steel and Oil fit? And I think the question's going to be twofold. One is, how good is that extra card, the card from the graveyard? How much unearth is there? How many Tenacious Underdogs are there? Is that relevant? Is that a meaningful upside? Yes or no? If it is, then that's a vote in favor of Dreams of Steel and Oil. The other question is, what's the meta gonna look like? Right now we're in a pretty creature heavy format, although at the same time, you're not getting Fable the Mirror Breaker or a Wedding Announcement or a Planeswalker with Dreams. When Duress would get those, Pilfer would get those. But if we end up in a Standard that's very creature heavy and most of the non-creatures are gonna be artifacts, then Dreams of Steel and Oil could be the way to go as discard. So right now I'm still on Team Pilfer. I just love the flexibility of Pilfer, even though it's 1 more mana, but I could see a world where Dreams of Steel and Oil is a go-to discard spell that could even show up in main decks in the right meta. We also got a pretty spicy one in Fateful Handoff, and when I first read this card, I was super hyped because I thought it was Black Harmless Offering, but then the more I thought about it, it's not quite. So 4 mana sorcery, you draw cards equal to the mana value of target artifact or creature you control, and then an opponent gains control of it. So this reads a lot like a Harmless Offering that can also draw you a bunch of cards, which sounds really sweet. The problem is, if you think about Harmless Offering, what are you harmlessly offering to your opponent that's going to win the games? Most of the time, it's like Demonic Pact or 9 Lives, enchantments. In Fateful Handoff can't give away enchantments, so it is going to be harder to just immediately win with Fateful Handoff. Drawing the cards is a nice bonus, and I guess you could like play Azur and try to turn your Demonic Pact into a creature and then give it away, but that sounds like a lot of extra steps. But I think as just a straight up give your opponent something evil and win the game combo piece, Fateful Handoff gonna be a lot harder to pull off than Harmless Offering. That said, there's still some brutal things you can give your opponent, like a Cody to lock your opponent out of playing permanent spells, Steel Golem to lock creatures out of the game, Bronze Bombshell for damage. In Standard, Zolcanar, use the good modes, give it to your opponent, and then your opponent's gonna have to exile it and give it back to you anyway, and you get to draw 5 cards along the way. So even though you don't have the I win modes as easily as Harmless Offering, there's still some sweet shenanigans for this card. In Commander, I think this most obviously fits in decks that are built around giving your opponent evil gifts, things like Blim or John Urkinus or the Beamtown Bullies. Fateful Handoff seems perfect there, since you want to be giving your opponent things anyway, these hard to deal with, evil, wreck your board, wreck your hand type creatures. Fateful Handoff is just kind of like a backup to your commander that's also going to let you refill your hand. Speaking of refilling your hand, you could also just focus on that mode of Fateful Handoff. Like in Standard, we have Shadow Immortality, which is 15 mana, but you can get the cost down all the way to 2 if you lose a bunch of life. Sure, you'd have to give your opponent a 7/7, but you're drawing 15 cards, so it's perfectly fine. Probably the memeiest thing to do is Scornful Egotist. 8 mana, 1/1, so your opponent's only getting 1/1, but you're getting to draw 8 cards. The other thing to mention in Standard is you can do some shenanigans with this with creatures that are going to die anyway, like Unearth a creature or Blitz a creature, and then Fateful Handoff it to draw a bunch of cards, and then your opponent's gonna get that creature, but because of Unearth or Blitz, it's gonna sacrifice anyway, so it's a temporary gift to your opponent. So I can imagine like, for 8 mana, you can Unearth a Mindbreaker, a Teresian Mindbreaker. Since you get to draw equal to mana value, it's going to draw you 7 cards, and then your opponent's gonna lose it anyway thanks to Unearth. So there's some shenanigans there. So Fateful Handoff, it's a really cool card. If you got more ideas of how to abuse this, how can we turn this into a real Harmless Offering? Let me know in the comments, because I love these cards. I love building decks around these janky give your opponent stuff effects. So if you got some ideas, make sure to let me know. We also got one of the most exciting commander cards from the whole set, Yawgmoth Praetor. So 3 mana 3/3 legendary Phyrexian Praetor. When a creature deals combat damage to one of your opponents, its controller may pay a life if they do draw a card, and then you can pay 7 mana, discard X cards, exile the top X cards to target opponent's library, and you can play lands and cast spells from among the exiled cards without paying their mana cost. So Gix is essentially Black Edric is the easiest way to think about it. Yeah, you gotta pay life, but essentially it works just like Edric. You attack your opponents, you draw a bunch of cards. Your opponents will probably attack each other because they want to draw the card, so it's actually some weird protection for you as well. And then that last mode, there's not a direct comparison, but it's kind of like a Villainous Wealth. You do need cards in hand, but it snowballs. Like if you have a big board, you attack and draw a bunch of cards, and then if those cards aren't that exciting, well, you just discard them to the second ability and get like a Villainous Wealth effect from your opponent's library. So Gix seems like a really, really fun commander to build around. As far as Standard is concerned, I'm a little meh on it. So what Gix really wants is a deck of go wide evasive creatures. You want to build a big board of stuff your opponent can't block, and then slam Gix, and then attack, and like draw 4 cards or 5 cards, and then even if Gix dies, it kind of did its job already. You already got your value out of it. The problem is, even though there's a ton of black decks in Standard, most of them are more mid-range. You're like Blood Tithe Harvester, into Graveyard Trespasser, into Sheoldred, so you're just not going to have that big board full of creatures to really maximize Gix potential. That said, if you want to build a Gix deck, the pieces are there, like Overload on 1-drops, Cult Conscript, Valve Sleeper, Ashnod. Try to get like 3 1-drops on the battlefield the first 2 turns, and then Gix and attack, and hopefully draw 3, and then no matter what happens, you already kind of won that exchange. The same thing could work in a format like Pioneer. I'm almost wondering if people just try this in Mono Black Aggro and Pioneer, maybe like a one of, where you're already playing a million recursive 1-drops, so you can just play a copy of Gix and refill your hand, get some more action to keep the game going. I think in Commander it's going to be really, really interesting. So it's literally Edric. It works just like Edric, but as a commander, black is a weird color for an Edric effect. If you think about how Edric decks are most commonly built, you play evasive 1-drop, stuff like Slitherblade or 1/1 flyers, flying men effects, and then what you're hoping to do is play Edric, draw a ton of cards, hit a Time Warp effect, some sort of extra turn effect, play that, and then do it again, and do it again, and you just snowball through your deck and kill your opponents as you draw through your entire deck with Edric. Gix is going to have a hard time doing that. There's just not the pieces. You don't have as many evasive 1-drops, or at least as good of evasive 1-drops. You don't have the extra turn spells. So I think that it's going to be interesting to see how this works in Commander. I think it's less strong than Edric as an Edric effect, although that last mode is really exciting. And as we've seen with stuff like Curse of Opulence, if you can incentivize your opponents to attack each other, that goes a long, long way. Like, many opponents will attack the person that has a Curse of Opulence on them to make a single gold token rather than attacking you, when Gix is offering potentially a whole bunch of cards because it triggers on each creature. I think this is actually going to be really good defense. If you play this, your opponents probably aren't going to come at you. They're going to attack each other so they can draw a bunch of cards. So this kind of works like an odd Ghostly Prison effect in black as well. And then that last mode is super sweet when it works. Another way to think of this is kind of like a Toski that impacts your opponents, and I think that might be Gix's main home. I'm excited to build a deck with Gix as a commander just to see how it works, but I think where this will see a ton of play is in any sort of go-wide deck that has black, especially ones that don't have Toski, aren't in green, or maybe even on top of Toski. So think of like Edgar Markov or Lathril. These are decks that go really wide with tokens. Yes, Gix isn't a vampire. It's not an elf, so a little bit of a flavor fail there, but you just make a big board of vampires or elf tokens, and then you Gix, and you draw a ridiculous number of cards and probably win the game. Could also work with like zombies with Verena. Alayla makes a ton of flyers, seems perfect. Maronar. So as long as you can get past the flavor fail, the playing Toski as a bird quote unquote thing that Richard does, as long as you're okay with that, I think that Gix is just a really nice addition as a payoff, as a card draw effect for some of these go wide tribal decks that don't have access to Toski. So Gix, I really like this card. Skeptical that it's going to do a ton in Standard. I hope it does, though, because stealing your opponent's cards and casting them for free is super cool. A little skeptical that it actually takes off in Standard, but maybe there's a black aggro deck that can make it work. Worst case, seems like a really exciting commander card, either as your commander or in the 99 of those go-wide decks. Next up, we got Gix's Command, and before we read this card, I gotta say, and I want to know what y'all think, but my opinion so far, this is what, day 3, video 3 of spoilers, so we went through 3 commands. These commands seem kind of underpowered to me. Like, not that they're horrible, but they seem very, very safe. They're sorceries, which is a big drawback. Most of them are sorceries, and they just seem a little overcosted for what they actually do. So I don't know, am I off base? What do you think about the commands as a whole from this set? Anyway, Gix's Command, 5-mana sorcery. You get to choose 2 of, put 2 counters on a creature you control. It gains lifelink until end of turn. Destroy each creature with power 2 or less. Return up to 2 target creature cards from your graveyard to your hand, or each opponent sacks a creature with the highest power among creatures they control. So if you actually look at these, mode 1 is literally Essence Infusion, a 2-mana sorcery. Mode 2, destroy each creature power 2 or less. There's actually not a good comparison for this. The best I could find is Solar Tide. There's a lot of these wraths that are like mana value 3 or less, or different twists on that we have access to, but power 2 or less is a weird thing to trigger based on. We just haven't really had that before, other than Solar Tide. The third mode, Soul Salvage. The last mode, we actually don't have that effect either, sacking a creature of the highest power. We have stuff like Soul Shatter, which is highest mana value, which is roughly the same most of the time, so it's probably a fine enough comparison. So I think for me, the big reason I'm skeptical of this is I think the removal modes are the most exciting of the bunch. I think the Wrath mode in specific is the calling card. If you think of the other modes, I don't think you're getting your mana worth. Like 2 counters on a creature and lifelink, return 2 creatures from your graveyard to your hand. Not super good. Sacrifice something, return a creature to your hand, not super good. The Wrath mode is the mode that needs to be good to make Gix's Command worth it, because Wraths are 4 or 5 mana anyway. The problem is, I don't think hitting creatures of power 2 or less hits enough creatures. Again, if you go back to like the top 20, 25 creatures that see play in Standard, it just doesn't kill much. You get Denic, Thalia, Phyrexian Missionary, Malevolent Hermit, and then maybe if you're lucky, Rafine or Brutal Cathar. So you're looking at 25% of creatures, and that might even be being a little generous when you consider how fast Rafine grows, that Brutal Cathar can flip. So I feel like that Wrath mode is going to be really, really limited, and that might limit Gix's Command to being more of a sideboard card. If you run into a deck that's like built around 1/1 tokens, some sort of Jetmir token deck, this could be very, very good. But I think in general, against most of the decks in the standard meta, the Wrath mode just doesn't hit enough creatures. And if the Wrath mode isn't good, I think the card isn't especially good. And I think that's doubly true when you consider the competition. Like, remember, this is a 5-mana black card. That means you could be casting something busted like Invoke Despair. You could playing a Cruelty of Gix, two very, very powerful cards. And then if you're in a multicolor black deck, you could have a AO, you could have a Workshop War Chief, you could have a Burn Down the House. And Gix's Command, even though it's flexible, even though it's a command, even though charm style cards with multiple modes often play up a little bit and are a little better than they look, I'm just not seeing it with Gix's Command. So I think this one is mostly a flop. Like I said, maybe the meta shifts in the right way where this can be a sideboard card to like hose tokens or weenie decks. But in general, I think I'm sticking with Invoke Despair and some of the other options in the 5-drop slot. We also got Gixian Puppeteer, and this card's pretty sweet. So with 3-mana 4/3 Phyrexian Warlock, when you draw your second card each turn, each opponent loses 2 life, you gain 2 life. Another piece for the draw your second card deck that we've talked about a little bit. And then when it dies, you get to return another target creature with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So Gixian Puppeteer, it is a powerful effect. I don't know how easy it's going to be for most decks to trigger the first mode, but the second mode's really good. Dying and getting back something up to 3 mana value is super, super nice. The problem I have is there's a lot of competition here. Sheoldred is just better at draining. It's easier. It kind of does the same thing, but you don't have to try to draw 2 cards a turn. As much as I like drawing cards, it's just a lot of extra work to make Puppeteer work compared to Sheoldred. Plus, Sheoldred has a better body, and then if you're trying to reanimate stuff, Body Launderer might just be better, especially when you consider that it can connive and then it has Death Touch, and that's a card that hasn't really seen any play in Standard. So Gixian Puppeteer might just thread the needle in this weird way where even though it's strong, it's not quite Sheoldred, it's not quite Body Launderer. That said, there are a lot of good 3-drops to get back into play. Adeline, Corpse Appraiser, Rafine, Anointed Peacekeeper, Brutal Cathar. There's some incredibly strong 3-drops, and it works well with Rafine because you can connive stuff into the graveyard and get it back. So I think there's potential here. I'm excited to try this, even though I'm not sure it's as good as Sheoldred, but I'm excited to try this in the Rafine decks in specific, or maybe some sort of white-black deck. Like, with Rafine, you connive, you trigger the first mode to do some draining, and then once your Puppeteer dies, you get something back. The dream mode is you play this with Extraction Specialist, and you could build like the grindiest deck ever. Your Puppeteer gets back Extraction Specialist, which gets back Commando, and you just keep running through your graveyard and grinding out value. So I think there's homes for this deck. I think Esper's worth trying. I don't know if it beats out Sheoldred. I want to build a white-back graveyard grind deck where this seems perfect with Extraction Specialist, so we'll have to wait and see. Reading this card, it seems like a card that should be standard playable. Can I beat out the other options that it's competing with? That's the question. We also got Gurgling Anointer, which 3-mana 1/3 flying. When you draw your second card each turn, you get a +1/+1 counter on, and then when it dies, you get to return another target creature card with mana value less than or equal to its power from your graveyard to the battlefield. So this would go very well in a Gixian Puppeteer deck. We were talking about Extraction Specialist. This can kind of do the same thing. Plus, it's another, when you draw your second card creature that is going to grow as you're drawing your second card. That's the main reason I wanted to mention it. If there is a draw 2 cards a turn deck that exists in Standard, this could work, and it could be very good in that deck. If you can grow this, it can be a good reanimation effect. So we'll have to wait and see. I don't think this is really in the conversation for most decks, but if you're built around its mechanic in specific, I think it's close enough to being playable on right that you could throw it in the deck. We also got another reprint and go for the throw. So 2-mana instant, destroy target non-artifact creature, and this is essentially competing with Infernal Grasp. So when this was first printed in New Phyrexia, I want to say, or Mirrored in Besiege, one of those, it was very, very hyped. When you read destroy target non-artifact creature, it almost reads like a murder because most of the time you're not facing artifact creatures. So you kind of think of it as like kill anything for 2 mana with no drawback. The problem is we're heading into an artifact set and Brothers War is full of artifact creatures. So if a lot of those see play, it gets a lot less consistent. In the current meta, if you could take our current meta before Brothers War released, I think this is way better than Infernal Grasp. It kills pretty much everything that you want to kill, and you don't lose life. So in the current meta, this would be bonkers. On the other hand, if a bunch of Brothers War artifacts are seeing play, once we get our new set and we go into new standard, then this goes down a little bit in value. Not that it's unplayable. It's still going to kill Sheoldred, it's still going to kill Thalia, it's still going to kill Graveyard Trespasser, whatever big threat you want to kill. But if there's a lot of artifacts, maybe Infernal Grasp is still in the conversation, even though that loss of life does add up and hurt a bit. Next up, we got one of my favorite designs from the set, Hostile Negotiations. This card just seems so much fun. So 3-mana instant, you exile the top 3 cards of your library face down, then you exile the top 3 cards of your library in another face down pile. So you're gonna have 2 piles of 3 face down exiled cards. You get to look at those piles, and then you get to choose one of those piles to flip face up, and then an opponent is gonna choose one of the piles to put in your hand. The other pile goes in the graveyard, and you lose 3 life. So this is essentially a instant speed, ambitions cost, or ancient craving, a 4-mana draw 3 in black, but really it's kind of the black factor fiction. It's that mini game sub game where you're going to end up drawing 3 cards, which is kind of what you should normally get out of factor fiction if your opponent splits the pile properly, and you get to do it at instant speed, and the extra cards are filling your graveyard, which is a really big upside. So I think Hostile Negotiations could actually be pretty good. I don't know where it'll show up in standard. I think in standard, and really in all formats, the decks that are going to want this the most are not ones that are just playing it to draw cards. They're decks that are also trying to fill your graveyard. So if you're trying to get Titan of Industry in your graveyard for Cruelty of Gix, or get lands in your graveyard for Soul and Windgrace, or even just mill Tenacious Underdogs to blitz them for extra value, then Hostile Negotiations goes way up in value, because then you're drawing 3 cards, but the other 3 cards are actually serving a purpose as well. They're not just going to waste in your graveyard. A draw 3 for 4 instant speed, not bad, but a draw 3 for 4 instant speed that is also supporting your game plan is actively good. So I think that's the main home in standard. I think the other thing to keep in mind with this card is you should be able to get a little bit more value out of it compared to like an ambitions cost or something like that. And not just because it's an instant. Like, being an instant is one of the upsides, but when you think about psychology and how Magic players' brains works, one thing I've learned from things like Morphs and Manifest is players have an irrational fear of the unknown. Like, people kill Morphs way more than they should because they're afraid that there's like some, 0.001 chance that it's like the random morph that's going to be the best one in the situation and wreck them. I think this card is going to play the same way. I think if you are good at choosing which pile to put face up, there's a decent chance that you're going to be able to get the better of the 2 piles, especially if that is the face up pile, because your opponent, I think, is going to be a little biased towards giving you the face up cards because they're going to be afraid that there's some ridiculous thing in the face down pile. So I think this should often be a little bit better than just drawing 3 random cards. As far as Commander is concerned, I think it's kind of the same thing. You could jam this in any black deck because it's a really fun design, and for card draw, it would be fine in that context. But I think where this is really going to shine is in those decks that want things in the graveyard. Jared, Gitrog Monsters, Sidisi, the Mimeoplasm, Cardor. If you're a black deck that is also trying to fill the graveyard, then I think this is probably like Painful Truce level. I love Painful Truce. I think it's like kind of a staple level card draw 3 for 3. I think if you're trying to fill your graveyard, this might just be better than Painful Truce in decks like that. So keep that in mind. If you're a graveyard based black deck in Commander, this is probably going to be an all-star, and it's fine in any black deck just because it's really fun. These mini game sub game style cards are just always so fun to resolve. So can jam it in any black deck, especially good in graveyard decks though. We also got Misery Shadow, which another card I think is pretty good. Black is pretty solid in this set. 2 mana 2/2 Shade. If a creature an opponent controls would die, exile it instead. Pay 1, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. So Misery Shadow is kind of like the standard version of Duthi Voidwalker. Very power down, but they never put Voidwalker in standard. But it's the 2-drop that can be fairly aggressive and also hates on your opponent's graveyard, combined with a upgraded Nantucko Shade, a Nantucko Shade that can pump with any mana, only costs a single black mana rather than double black, and both of these cards have proven to be very good. Nantucko Shade might not look like much, but in the past it's been a very solid card, and Voidwalker obviously a very strong modern and commander card. Misery Shadow I think can serve a a role in Standard. Hating on the graveyard is actually pretty relevant. It gets rid of Tenacious Underdogs, it gets rid of Unearthed creatures, it gets rid of Disturbed creatures, it keeps the graveyard empty for Corpse Appraisers, and it also hates on death triggers because it says if a creature would die, exile it instead. It's a replacement effect, so that means AO isn't going to be putting things into play when it dies. It's not going to be triggering it all when it dies. So this actually hits on a lot of different cards in Standard, although it is worth mentioning it only hits on creatures, and it only hits on creatures going to the graveyard from the battlefield, from creatures dying. So it is a little limited there, but I think that form of graveyard hate is good enough. And then the Shade mode actually makes it a real threat. If you attack with this with a bunch of mana up, it's often just going to be unblockable because your opponent's going to know, well, if I block it, they'll just pump it a couple times and kill my thing, and I don't want that. So it's going to get in way more damage than it should. So I think that this is a card that maybe not quite Tenacious Underdog. I feel like I've said that a lot this video. Underdog is just so good. Maybe not quite Tenacious Underdog or Blood Tithe Harvester or Phyrexian Missionary, but I think we're going to see a decent amount of this cards. I think this will be the second 2-drop in a lot of these decks. If you're playing Rakdos or Jund, you're going to have Blood Tithe Harvester because it's really busted, but then a couple of Misery Shadows. If you're playing Mono Black, you got Tenacious Underdog, but then a couple of Misery Shadows. Or if you're playing Orzhov, maybe you got Phyrexian Missionary, but then a couple of Misery Shadows. So I think we're going to see this card a lot in Standard, hating on graveyards and being a decent aggro threat. Next up, we got a uncommon reanimation spell and no one left behind. So 5 mana, return a creature from a graveyard to the battlefield, or 2 mana, return a creature mana value 3 or less from a graveyard to the battlefield. So I think the flexibility is the selling point here. If you're a Reanimator style deck, this can get back your Titan of Industry for 5 mana, which is kind of the going rate for standard reanimation. Or maybe earlier in the game, you're getting back a Blood Tithe Harvester or something like that. So I don't think this is a staple level card, but if you are a Reanimator deck and you have a mixture of expensive stuff and cheap stuff, I think this is at least in the conversation as the second reanimation spell. I think Cruelty of Grix is number 1. This is probably number 2. In Commander, there's just way better ways to reanimate, and the same is true of older formats, so I don't think it makes it outside of Standard, but in Standard could have some relevance in Reanimator. We also got Overwhelming Remorse, which is a pretty interesting card. 5 mana instant, exile target creature or planeswalker, and it costs 1 less to cast for each creature card in your graveyard. So this could be 1 mana, exile a creature or planeswalker if you have 4 more creatures in your graveyard. And I think this is kind of a home run for any sort of graveyard deck. If the plan of your deck is to fill your graveyard, and I'm including formats like Pioneer, maybe even Modern, I think this can be a really good card. It reminds me of Murderous Cut a little bit, the Delve removal spell that was also 5 mana. The upside here is you don't actually have to exile your graveyard, and you get to exile your opponent's creatures or planeswalkers rather than just destroying them. So you get to keep your graveyard full, but you're still getting the cost reduction. The downside is it only cares about creatures, so it's not any card. You can't crack fetch lands to reduce the cost or whatever. But if you're some sort of self-mill graveyard deck, and you can get this down to 1 mana, or even 2 mana, or really honestly even 3 mana, it's not the end of the world, then I think this is a playable card, and it's a common, so I expect we're going to see a lot of this in Pauper. So if you're a graveyard deck, based on getting creatures in your graveyard, all the way back to Commander, or Pauper, or Modern, or Pioneer, or definitely Standard, Overwhelming Remorse, probably in the conversation for a removal spell because it's just so efficient and good at what it does. We also got another reprint in Painful Quandary. So Painful Quandary, 5 mana enchantment. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, that player loses 5 life unless they discard a card. This is the second run through Standard for Painful Quandary, and sadly the first time it was in Standard, it saw 0 play. Did some research, went back, looked through old deck lists. I cannot find a single instance of anyone making this card work in Standard, and I think that's going to be true this time around as well. When you consider that for 5 mana, you can just invoke Despair and wreck your opponent and draw a bunch of cards, Painful Quandary, it's just a little bit janky. Like, it's super slow. You play it, your opponent has to cast spells for it to do anything. If your opponent's already ahead on board, which if you're taking off turn 5 to play Painful Quandary, they probably will be, they won't even really need to cast things. Plus, decks sometimes don't care about discarding cards. Remember when Tenacious Underdog Standard, your opponent can cast a spell, just discard their Tenacious Underdog or their Unearthed creature and put it back into play anyway. No harm, no foul. So I think the Painful Quandary, I think we'd build a funny against the odds deck around it. I'm excited about it from that perspective. But as far as being a good card or a competitive card, probably save it for the commander tables. On the other hand, oh my god, we got a new prototype creature, the mythic black prototype creature in Phyrexian Fleshgorger, and this card I think is kind of absurd. So 7 mana, 7/5, Menace lifelink, ward pay life equal to its power. However, it is prototyped for 3 mana as a 3/3. So essentially, this is a 3 mana, 3/3 Menace lifelinker that is ward pay 3 life, or a 7 mana, 7/5 Menace lifelink with ward pay 7 life. That flexibility is absurd. The ward is a really good form of protection. Menace and lifelink is really nice. It's a good way to gain back life, to stabilize. I think that Phyrexian Fleshgorger has potential to be a staple level card, at least in standard. So its prototype mode is kind of Grim Dancer, which I know isn't the best comparison, but it's way better than that, because you get the ward, you get artifact synergies, and you get the flexibility of maybe casting it for 7 mana and just getting this huge game-ending threat. Who's going to be able to, in the late game, afford to pay 7 life to actually deal with the Fleshgorger? It seems so game-ending, and Menace makes it hard to block, and lifelink is going to stabilize you. It reminds me a little bit of Wurmcoil in a weird way. I know it's not a great comparison, but it's this massive mythic worm that can gain a ton of life and just slam the door shut in the late game. So I think that Phyrexian Fleshgorger has potential to be a standard staple. If you want to go really deep with the card, you can prototype it and then blink it to try to get the more expensive half, to get the 7/5 half of the card. We do have some ways to do this in standard. The best is probably Touch the Spirit Realms, one of my favorite standard cards. A fine removal spell that you can also blink something with its channel mode, but there's Planar Incision, there's Golden Argosy. So in theory, for like 5 total mana, you play Fleshgorger, then you just take and Touch the Spirit Realms it, and you get the 7/5, and you smash your opponent, and you probably win the game. But I don't think you need these shenanigans to make Fleshgorger good. I think it's just straight up a good card, to the point where maybe it's Graveyard Trespasser good. That's kind of the big 3-drop in black decks in standard, is Graveyard Trespasser. I think it might be better, or at least it's very, very close to it, and can see you play alongside Graveyard Trespasser. It's just a really efficient card, and maybe there's a chance you can do some shenanigans in older formats. In older formats, I think the blink plan becomes a lot more appealing. I don't know if you remember, a while ago we played a budget Magic deck where the idea was to play a Morph to Chroma and then just blink it with a Ephemerate or Eldrazi Displacer to get the huge flying half to win the game. Fleshgorger kind of works the same way. You play it as a prototype and then you just blink it and get this huge threat. So I'm excited to build like a Eldrazi Displacer, Ephemerate blink style deck with these cards in Modern, maybe in Pioneer. So I think Phyrexian Fleshgorger, one of the best cards from the set, just on rate, with its abilities, with lifelink, with Menace. It's just a really, really good card, and I expect this one to be a standard staple, and maybe in the right deck even sneak into older formats. We also got Powerstone Fracture. 2 mana sorcery is an additional cost to cast this spell. Second, artifact or creature, destroy target creature or planeswalker. The one reason I want to mention this is it works with Powerstone. So if there's some sort of Powerstone deck, maybe this has a shot. You sack your useless Powerstone, blow up your opponent's best thing, but we got a lot of Bone Shard effects in standard already, so I'm not sure how relevant it'll be, but I don't know. If you're based around sacking Powerstones or artifacts, it could be worse in your removal slot. We also got Razorlash Transmogrant, which is another pretty interesting card. It's an artifact zombie. It's a 2 mana 3/1. It can't block, and then you can pay 6 mana to return it from your graveyard to the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it, so it'll be a 4/2. More importantly, the ability costs 4 less to activate if an opponent controls 4 or more non-basic lands. So in most matchups, by the mid-game, when this would have theoretically died and gotten into the graveyard, your opponent should have enough non-basic lands. There's exceptions. If you play mono red or against mono black, it's not going to work, but against most decks, you should be able to get this back from your graveyard for 2 mana, which is actually really good. It compares to Scrap Heap Scrounger, I think, is the best comparison. Also a 2-drop that can't block and comes back from your graveyard. Razorlash, super similar, except it might just be better because you don't have to have creatures in your graveyard exile. Plus, it comes back from the graveyard with more power. Another comparison might be Skyclave Shade, where Skyclave can come back from the graveyard, and if you kick it, it can be a 5/3. And we've seen both of these cards see a lot of play. We have blood tokens to get this in the graveyard, or you can just cast it and attack with it and have it die. So I think this could be very good in standard. Alongside alongside something like Tenacious Underdog, now that we have Razorlash and Tenacious Underdog, there's so many recursive black threats that are actually really, really powerful. So maybe we see some sort of black aggro deck. We were talking about Gix earlier and how Gix really wants a bunch of aggro creatures. Maybe you can build a deck that's Gix, a ton of 1-drops, Razorlash, Tenacious Underdog, and just go to town with this like mono black aggro deck that can draw a ridiculous number of cards. It could show up in older formats as well. Scrappy Scrounger doesn't see as much play as it used to, but it does occasionally show up a little bit in like mono black aggro and Pioneer. Maybe Razorlash is better. I think there's upsides and downsides. Like, if Razorlash is always going to be 2 mana on turn 4 or turn 5, it's just a better Scrap Heap Scrounger. On the other hand, if you run into mono green or you run into mono red and it's 6 mana to get back from the graveyard, then it's pretty useless. Like, that's way, way too much to actually get it back from the graveyard. So there's a little bit of risk matchup. Why Scrap Heap Scrounger, I think, is more consistent. But as long as your opponent's playing a bunch of non-basics, then I think Razorlash is just better. The other place where this will probably show up, and this doesn't really read like a commander card, but there is one commander deck in specific where I think this is probably great, and that's Imhotep the Stormlord, one of the new 40k commanders that specifically cares about artifacts leaving your graveyard. When an artifact leaves the graveyard, you get 2 black Necron warrior artifact creature tokens. So Razorlash is an artifact that can just repeatedly leave your graveyard. In Commander, you're always going to have opponents that have enough non-basic lands to make it 2 mana. So you just play it from your graveyard for 2 mana, get the 2 tokens with Imhotep, and then sack it to something and do it again and do it again and make a huge board full of tokens. So I think in Imhotep in specific, Razorlash is going to be great. So I think really good standard card, maybe a Pioneer card, and a nice upgrade for your Imhotep commander decks. We also got a new altar, Transmogrant Altar, 3 mana artifact. Play a black, sack a creature, add 3 generic mana, or pay 2 tap it, sack a creature, create a 3/3 zombie artifact creature token. Activate it only as a sorcery. So this is a really, really safe altar. When you think of altars, I think of Ashnod's Altar, Phyrexian Altar, and these cards are kind of infamous combo pieces. The big difference here is Transmogrant Altar needs you to tap it to actually activate it. So you can't do it a whole bunch of times in one turn. It makes the same amount of mana as Ashnod's Altar, but is essentially a once per turn effect rather than a repeatable effect. So it's really a Ashnod's Altar or Phyrexian Altar, but without the combo potential, which makes it a much less powerful card, but in some ways that might be okay. In Standard, I don't know, maybe you can play an Oni called Anvil. It's cute with like blitz creatures. You can blitz your underdog and then sack it to make a zombie since you're going to lose it anyway, or sack it for some mana. In Commander, it reminds me of the Golden Throne a little bit. And one of the problems with cards like Ashnod's Altar or cards like Phyrexian Altar is they're so scary that people are going to try to kill you. Everyone knows their combo pieces. So once they hit the battlefield, everyone's like, oh no, we got to take out the person with Ashnod's Altar, because if we don't, they're going to combo off and win the game. So in some ways, it's an upside that Transmogrant Altar isn't a combo piece. It literally can't be a combo piece. So if you're trying to play a sacrifice deck, but you're not trying to go infinite, I think there's an argument for playing this or the Golden Throne, which is actually kind of similar, another new card, over Ashnod's Altar or Phyrexian Altar, because they're not going to draw as much hate. When your opponent sees these, they're going to say, okay, they're sacrificing stuff, they're going to get some value, but I don't have to worry that they're just going to play the right thing and go infinite and kill me next turn. So I really like this as an option for like Tisa Karlov or Rada Drabik or Yawgmoth, these sacrifice decks that aren't trying to win with one big infinite combo, but instead trying to generate incremental value. I think in those situations, there is an argument to maybe playing these over the more combo-y altars. So definitely an interesting card. Where exactly it fits, I don't know. No combo potential, but I am excited to see what it does. We also got Transmogrant's Crown, a 2 mana equipment. Gives a equipped creature +2/+0, and when a equipped creature dies, you draw a card, equipped for 2 or for a single black. So this is another card that could have a role in Standard. Like, it seems fine in Standard, especially if you're a black deck and you can equip it for 1 mana. The pump is fine, and then as your creatures die, you get to draw cards. Imagine sticking this on Tenacious Underdog after you blitz it for 1 mana to hit for more damage, and when it dies, you draw 2 cards. That's a huge source of card advantage. You're sticking on things you're going to sacrifice to Oni called Anvil anyway. In Commander, it reminds me a little bit of a very safe, very fixed Skull Clamp, but they kind of could go in the same deck. So you just throw your crown on top of the Skull Clamp creature, and when it dies, you're drawing 3 cards. That's a ridiculous source of card advantage. So that 1 mana equip cost is what really has me interested. 4 sacrifice decks in Commander. In Standard, I'm going to try it, although I'm a little worried that there's just not enough room. Black decks are so stuffed full of strong cards already that I'm not sure there's going to be room for it, but maybe this could be a piece for like that Gix deck we were talking about, the very aggro, all the 1-drop black decks. That's probably where Crown will shine the most, and then we can even better take advantage of the card advantage, because once our stuff dies, we're going to draw cheap stuff that let us flood the board. So those are all the relevant black cards from the Brothers War, which means it is time to talk about our top 3 cards for Standard, Modern, and Pioneer, and also Commander. So starting off with Standard, number 3, Ashnod Flesh Mechanist. I just really like this card. I like 1 mana 1/1 Death Touchers. There's a lot of creatures it trades up with, and it gives some nice late game value. Not really stoked about the Powerstone thing, but yeah, in the right deck, that ability could do something too. Number 2, Misery Shadow. It's just an on-curve creature that's hard to block thanks to its shade ability, and the Graveyard Hate mode seems really relevant in a format with Blitz and Graveyard decks, and Unearth now entering the format. And then number 1, Phyrexian Fleshgorger. The card's just bonkers. Obviously, if you do the Blink shenanigans, it's insane, but I don't even think you need to do that. You just play it as a 3/3 for 3 with a ton of abilities, or if it's late, and games in Standard go really long, so it's not unlikely that you're going to get to 7 mana, you just cast it as this almost unbeatable 7/5 that's going to be so hard to actually kill with removal, because who can afford to spend 7 life for the war to get rid of it? Moving on to Pioneer and Modern, number 3, Overwhelming Remorse. Good for the graveyard decks. 1 mana, I think, especially for Pioneer, in something with Satyr Wayfinders like the Greasefang decks or like the pseudo Vengevine self-mill style decks, makes this a really attractive option. If you can get this down to 1 mana, it is playable, I think, all the way back to Modern. You got to be a little bit worried about Graveyard Hate. If your opponent plays a Rest in Peace or something, you're going to be sad. But the card is just so efficient that I think it has a chance to show up in those self-mill decks all the way back to Modern. Number 2, Razorlash Transmogrant. We already talked about this one not that long ago. Seems good for the black aggro decks. If you're playing like a Scrap Heap Scrounger in your mono black deck in Pioneer, I think this can just fill that role, but better in most matchups. And then number 1, the reprint Diabolic Intent. 2 mana tutors are kind of busted, and there's plenty of sack fodder in Modern, Yawgmoth, or other combo decks like Thopter Sword. In Pioneer, we got sacrifice decks that can easily take advantage of it, like the Cat Oven style deck. So there's plenty of pre-built homes where not only is this a demonic tutor, but you actually get some additional value out of sacking your creature. It's an upside, triggering your Mayhem Devil or whatever. So I think Diabolic Intent has a chance to really shake up some of those formats. Moving on to Commander, number 3, Transmogrant's Crown. I might be overrating this card, but that 1 mana equip cost has me really hyped to make this like a very watered down pseudo Skull Clamp in sacrifice decks, where this can just keep you churning through your deck. Imagine like in the right deck where you're sacking creatures, it's essentially pay 1 mana, draw a card, which that's very, very efficient compared to stuff like Greed. You're not losing any life, and it even pumps your creatures. Number 2, Hostile Negotiations. It's just a super fun card. I'm going to jam this in pretty much all my black decks as card draw, but like I said before, it goes up in value even more if you're playing a graveyard-based deck. And then number 1, and it's not even close, Yawgmoth Praetor. The Black Edict, it seems really fun to build around, and even outside of building around it, I think this can show up in the 99 of a lot of decks. It's sort of a Toski style effect, as a way to refill your hand if you're playing Edgar or Zombies or Elves. Any of these go-wide decks just is a great source of card advantage. So anyway, that brings us to the end of our black cards from the Brothers War. Let me know what you think. You've heard my opinion on all these cards. What's your top 3? What are you most excited about? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I will be back tomorrow to talk about some more Brothers War. We're about halfway done. We've gone through 3 colors, 2 more to go, then the colorless and multicolor cards. So until then, everyone, have a lovely day, and I will talk to you soon.